Good morning, and welcome to you all to this next session in our energy series. This session is entitled Oil, Money and Power, How Competition Could Create a New World Order. So a very warm welcome to you all again, and to all our visitors who are joining us from around the world online. Please don't forget to post your questions via that portal. This session is supported by Siemens Energy, for which we are very grateful. And before our panelists, led by New York Times energy correspondent Stanley joins us on stage, we'd just like to play a very short video. Thank you.
My name is Xu Qian Yan. I studied environmental engineering. Climate change is a scary thing. We don't know what could happen in the future, but I see a big opportunity in it. I work on hydrogen solutions for Siemens Energy. I think technologies could change the future. Hydrogen will play a huge role in the energy transition because it is produced only from water. Using it as a fuel doesn't generate any carbon dioxide or air pollution. It is the power of the present and the future and can be used to produce other fuels. And on top of that, hydrogen can be used as a storage. We could even store the energy from summer and use it for winter. And this gives us a chance to decarbonize our planet.
Good morning. Great to be here in Glasgow. I'm Stanley Reed. I write about energy and the environment. This session is about, it's called Oil, Money, and Power, How Competition Could Create a New World Order. And we have a great group of experts to talk about this. On my right is Richard Herrington, head of Earth Sciences at the Natural History Museum in London. Tzeporah Berman, who is chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Bertrand Piccard, an extraordinarily adventurous person who has been around the world in a balloon and a solar-powered airplane, and now has a foundation that focuses on sort of clean energy solutions in a very practical way. So I'm going to start with Richard. Richard is an expert on mining, and a lot of metals are going to be required for the energy transition that's coming, for batteries, for electric cars, and for solar panels and for wind turbines, which all use a tremendous amount of metals. So, Richard, how can we be sure that the transition to clean energy doesn't create a lot of problems, that similar to what we've seen in the old energy age that's passing?
No, it's a really good question, because obviously it's a revolution, and it's a very much a metals-based revolution, because we have to create this new infrastructure. It's a much more distributed infrastructure, much more connecting cabling and so on for the various types. And each of those new technologies demands a range of different metals we've got. And either traditional metals, so even things like iron for steel and copper and aluminium, they're going to need to be increased. But also some very speciality metals, if you like, things like lithium and cobalt. And one of the things is that we're going to have to ramp up production of something like the lithium and cobalt. Currently, we estimate by 500%. So that means an increase in raw material extraction. There's not enough in the recycling chain. We'd love to have a circular economy, but it's not there because we don't have the stocks. So in the short term, we're going to have to mine, and we really do have to be making sure that we put in mining solutions that are going to have a sustainable legacy. So we're going to engage, you have to engage with people and create systems that will be nature positive. So I think this is really important, that we don't solve the problem of carbon production from energy generation and then create another legacy issue. So, happy to explore more in detail, but that's the kind of broad terms.
We should leave it there and come back. So, Tzeporah, you're very frustrated at the pace that renewables are being installed. Could you just tell us a little bit about why you see that as happening?
No, thanks, Stanley. So, what's interesting is that we have been talking about how we need to scale up renewables, and countries have been making commitments on our emissions and our targets, and companies have been having major breakthroughs now for years. But 10 years ago, 80% of our energy on the planet was fossil fuel energy, oil, gas, and coal. Today, 80% of our energy use on the planet is oil, gas, and coal. So what's holding us back? And that's been a lot of my research, is trying to understand what's holding us back. And I think we see it here at COP26. A report came out yesterday that the single largest delegation in the world's climate negotiations conference are fossil fuel lobbyists. There are 100 fossil fuel companies present here at COP. So why does that matter? Well, there are 5 oil companies that have spent $1 billion since Paris in lobbying against climate policy. And if we're going to get the uptake of renewables that we need in order to meet our goals of staying below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, then we're going to need a massive scale-up of renewable energy. And that means breakthroughs in technology, sure, but it also means that we need to have government support and policy certainty for those projects and initiatives to thrive. So renewables have dropped in price so much that in most countries around the world, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels. Yet the UN production gap reports that we're currently on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels in the next decade than the world can ever burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. So we're currently spending the majority of our financial, our intellectual, and our political capital in digging up stuff that we know we can't burn, or it will burn us.
Okay, so Bertrand, you're an expert at pragmatic solutions, getting things done. I mean, what's the way to speed things up and get to where we all want to go?
The oil companies have the power and have a lot of money, which means that they will not like to change anything if they don't find a personal interest in changing. So we have to give them a personal interest. We have to show them that there are new business opportunities, that there are new sources of energy that are cheaper, and they can invest in that. They can get money with it. And hydrogen is one of the really interesting factors, because hydrogen is not just a new way to store energy and to use it. Hydrogen is a way to involve the oil industry into the transition, because they know how to produce, distribute, and sell a liquid. So it's not too much of a handicap for them, which is not the same for electric mobility with batteries, because they hate the batteries. They're out of it. So it would take much more time for them to diversify into battery charging stations and things like that. But we have to see the change might happen inside the system if they find an advantage, as what I said, but maybe it will come from outside the system. Right. It will come from smaller companies who will grow. And this is exactly what happened before with the oil companies. They took the place of the coal industry. And maybe the renewables will take the place of the oil industry if they don't diversify early enough. So it's very interesting to see that actually diversification for them is a question of survival. Mm-hmm. If they don't do it, others will take the place.
And how do we, just to follow up on, I mean, it seems like some of these technologies are going, you know, at quite slow pace. How do we speed it all up, do you think?
By showing what is financially profitable. I've done a lot of COPs, and I see that each time we speak about national determined contributions, commitments, targets to reach, everyone is afraid that it will be detrimental for his economical development. Mm-hmm. What I want to do with the Solar Impulse Foundation is to show and demonstrate and prove that it's exactly the opposite. Today, we have identified at the foundation and labeled 1,300 systems, processes, technologies, sources of energy, devices that are financially profitable to protect the environment. And what is really crazy is to see the time it takes for people to understand that this business is profitable, that they can go into it. But some oil companies, I have to say, do it more than other industries. Huh? When I spoke to the CEO and chairman of Total, I told him, well, I admire that you want to diversify from oil into hydrogen, natural gas, renewable electricity. And he told me, I have no choice. I have no choice. If I don't do it, my company will disappear. Right. So we see that there are opportunities, they are taking them, but exactly as it was said before, it takes too much time.
And Richard, are you concerned, I mean, I know your interest is in mining metals like lithium more sustainably and so on. Are you seeing any progress in terms of you know, putting in rules or having companies, you know, approach these industries, you know, in a careful way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely are. We've had issues. Everybody kind of knows the cobalt story of perhaps linkages to child labor in Central Africa. So there have been initiatives to make sure that actually artisanal mining is better regulated. It's not a bad thing in principle, because it's putting money into people straight into those communities. So things are happening like that. And then also there's a lot of appetite. And one of the things at the museum is we're trying to get people to understand it's not only the climate issue here. It's a biodiversity, it's a people and the planet issue. And so we're looking to be able to have metrics that would model those impacts and make sure that they are nature positive. So, and there is interest in that, and I've been encouraged at the conference here that there's a lot of recognition that biodiversity is part of. It's critical that we don't destroy that. So I'm confident that there's an appetite to bring better systems in.
You know, almost every large automobile, you know, as like original OEMs, as they call them, is going in a big way into electric vehicles. Are they aware of the, you know, potential, you know, dangers buying their lithium from the wrong place or...
Yeah, absolutely. So the manufacturers that we deal with are they look very much more down the supply chain to the producer, to the point where they'll be really concerned that they're sourcing those materials from a particular mine even, so that they know how well regulated it is. So it's quite different. I think it's going to be a big shift for them, because with hydrocarbons, it's a sort of a traded commodity much more widely, but the metals business is much more focused on particular mines where they're sourced, because each has different characteristics. So I think the manufacturers are having to respond to a different way of getting the materials sourced. So it's a big change for everybody, actually.
Or we're not going to see articles in the newspaper like we've seen about, China, where, this, clothing or whatever is being made, by prisoners or
I mean, that's the good thing about the current situation. There's much more reporting of these kind of things. I think we're aware of those, and I think...
So they won't get started
Well, that's what we hope, and I think particularly it's up to us to make sure, keep these people honest, and I think that there are networks in that both protect the people, and what we want is this extra bit of protecting the planet and its ecosystems.
Okay. I have, Tzeporah, one for you. I mean, we're starting to see quite powerful renewable energy companies. In this part of the world, we have Ørsted, which has built a lot of offshore wind and is now going into other things. Also, Iberdrola, the Spanish company, and there are others. How is that kind of changing the kind of power dynamic in terms of lobbying for what they want, and so are you seeing that at all?
I think right now the power of the fossil fuel industry still far outweighs the power of the renewable companies and the renewable industry, and we're also seeing a lot of integration of fossil fuel companies into the renewable sector, which really waters down, quite frankly, the renewable association's impact in lobbying governments, because they're saying, the oil, gas, and coal incumbents are saying that they're moving towards cleaner and safer systems, yet if you look at their CapEx, it's less than 2% is going into renewables for the majors. It's still primarily, they're working to hold on to and expand oil, gas, and coal. So part of how, if we look into the future and cleaner and clean renewable energy systems, then it shifts power dynamics, and it shifts power in all of its forms, because renewable energy is by its nature decentralized. And there are some examples like Ørsted of fossil fuel companies that will become renewable energy companies. They are very few, because the incumbents are not set up to do diversified and decentralized energy systems where they don't own, no one owns the wind and the sun. So ultimately you're putting in the infrastructure, but it's an initial, it's initial spend, and you don't control and own the future. So I think what's really critical at this moment in history is government spending, because if you look at the economics of innovation, some of the big success stories that we've seen actually come from government spending first. Google's search engine, for example, there's a tremendous work by an economist named Mariana Mazzucco, who she points out in her research that Google's search engine was a result of a grant from the U.S. National Science Foundation. Tesla had an initial struggle and had a $465 million loan from the U.S. Department of Energy, and in SolarCity, SpaceX, and Tesla all combined, it's about $4.9 billion in public support. But right now, look at what governments are spending their money on. During COVID, all of our governments increased support for oil, gas, and coal, the expansion of production. And just 2 weeks ago, the IMF put out a report saying fossil fuel subsidies have now hit record highs. So we're subsidizing these companies. The IMF reports $11 million a minute on the globe going to oil and gas companies to help them expand production. So we need to shift where public funding is going. We need to support innovation, but we also, the governments are going to need to put that money into infrastructure, because while the infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry, those pipes for oil and gas that could be used for geothermal, you know, that's private spend. So a lot of the infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry is a private spend, but the infrastructure that we need for the clean energy revolution, the electrification and the grid upgrades, that's a public spend. So we need to shift where governments are spending their money. And again, I think that relates back to, you know, to the fossil fuel industry. Right now, the G20 is spending 3 times as much money supporting the fossil fuel industry than it is on clean energy. And until that shifts and we get more policy certainty where governments are committing to production decline of fossil fuels, which we're not even talking about really yet in policy or global agreements, then you're going to have this same imbalance.
Bertrand, as a finance expert, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of money, you know, trillions of dollars going into, you know, what's called ESG investing. Is that moving the needle at all? Is it financing the some of the innovations that you've been identifying and backing?
Yes, and you might have heard last week when the president of the Fed was saying we need thousands of trillions for the ecological and climate transition. But it's a wrong way to present it, I'm sorry, because the hundreds and thousands of trillions, they exist. They are already invested in the industry, in the oil, gas, coal business. So it's not a question of creating more money in order to invest in a cleaner industry. It's a question of taking this money out of the dirty business to put it in the clean business.
The standards need to be stricter?
Yes, and you know what happens is that, of course, today, it's still possible to earn a bit of money by speculating on the price of oil and gas, and especially these days, I'm sure it's profitable for some people.
You can earn a lot of money.
Yeah, but if you look on the long term, it's exactly the opposite. And the biggest amount of money ready to be invested comes from pension funds and the life insurances. And they know for certain, they absolutely know for certain, that in 10 or 20 years, the investment in the oil and gas business will be divided by 2 or 3 in terms of value share. Because of carbon tax, because the renewables are cheaper, because people will be more energy efficient, they will insulate their house, they will have electric mobility. So there will be less need for oil, and in that sense, it can become exactly like the subprime crisis in 2008, stranded assets. If you hold a lot of investment in the oil business, and suddenly you see, wow, it's going to be divided by 2 or 3, you're going to sell it. If everybody is selling the investment in the oil and gas business at the same time, you have the biggest financial crash ever in the history of humankind. What does it mean? It means that we have to help the oil and gas company to diversify. If we just fight against them, we are lost. We need to make an alliance with them in order to help them, give them the solutions, give them the market, give them the regulation, give them everything they need to diversify into a clean business, and they need the finance for that. So this is where the funding has to go, and if they diversify early enough, they will not lose their market value at the stock exchange market, and they will survive. Otherwise, they will die, and if they die, we die with them.
Yeah, and
that I disagree with.
Sorry, I was going to ask you, in your efforts, you know, to
if they die too soon,
to curb
or suddenly
to curb fossil fuels. I mean, what sort of reception do you get from countries like Saudi Arabia or you know, Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates, where you know, which are very dependent on oil and gas revenues? I mean, what sort of, I mean, it's very, I think, worrying for them kind of what their future is, you know, without these businesses. Yeah.
Sure, and I think we've seen that here at COP26, where it's the Saudi Arabia and other countries lobbying against even the term fossil fuels being in the opening of the Glasgow Agreement. Many people don't know this, but these countries and the fossil fuel companies have been tremendously successful in actually making themselves and their products invisible. The Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words oil, gas, coal, or fossil fuels. So 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere causing climate change come from 3 products, oil, gas, and coal. But we've seen this tremendous lobby and refusal to actually acknowledge that and plan for production decline. And I think what we really need to recognize at this moment in history is that, yes, this is difficult. The transition is going to be difficult, but we are making it more difficult every day by growing the problem. We hear a lot from our leaders in the last week at COP26 that we're in a transition and we need a global transition. It's not a transition if you're continuing to grow the problem. It's a transition if you're winding it down. And
Very
so,
well said.
so for those countries where it's hardest, and my own country, it's not going to be easy. I come from Canada. We produce a lot of oil and gas.
Right.
And
in nasty ways too.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of
it
the
is a
tar
high
sands.
carbon. It is definitely a high carbon oil and fracked gas. But the fact is that right now what we're doing is we are regulating emissions, and then we're allowing the markets, as demand goes down. The idea is, the theory behind climate policy and agreements for 30 years has been demand's going to go down, the price of carbon will go up, and the markets will constrain supply. Let the markets decide which companies live or die, which technologies, etc. The problem is, it's not working. It's not working fast enough to keep us safe. And that we see that with the tremendous growth of new fossil fuel projects. The other problem is, if we allow the markets to decide who gets to produce and how much at this moment in history, then no equity or justice is taken into consideration whatsoever. We cannot, at this moment in history, allow the markets to decide the fate of humanity. So yes, it's going to be difficult for oil-dependent countries and gas and coal to plan for the decline of production. But if we don't start planning now, then we can't ensure that we support the workers and their families who are dependent on these industries. So that means planning now, and it means economic diversification, and it's going to mean support for countries in the global south who right now are doing more oil drilling just to feed their debt. Look at Ecuador, drilling in speaking of biodiversity hotspots.
Yeah.
Right now, new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon, the world's biodiversity hotspot, just to feed their debt. And that's why we need international cooperation and government leadership on the production side of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Can I just...
Sure.
Yeah.
I think just to answer to that, I think we focus too much in the discussions in general about the production of oil, gas, and coal. And we see the countries who produce, and we think they're going to die if they don't produce it. But we don't focus enough of energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is a very, very profitable way to use less of this energy. And when I was talking to the president of Poland, we had a really interesting meeting. He was trying to explain me why coal was so important for him, and I said, leave coal aside. You can be efficient in the heating systems, in the renovation of houses, in the industrial processes, and you can be the cleanest country in Europe in terms of CO2, despite the coal. And he was interested. And I think this is the type of discussions we have to be able to have with the people.
Low-hanging fruit.
Yes, we have to.
Absolutely.
We need everyone to do what he can. And some countries can something, and other countries can do other things. And we have to support each one in what he is able to do and not attack people on what they are not able to do. Otherwise, we'll have more losers than winners.
And Richard, you wanted to...
Yeah, just simply to say, I think it's what Tzeporah and Bertrand have said is really good. I mean, it's pushing one industry to get out of what they were doing before. And I think also it's drawing people into the kind of renewables and making sure that infrastructure's put in. You know, the variability in the infrastructure that's put, for example, in our own country, it's so patchy that people have that they call a range anxiety. They won't buy They won't buy an electric vehicle because they think they'll run out of electricity before they can recharge. And this is where we're going back to this infrastructure side. I think it needs to be, we need to be drawn at one end and pushed at the other. And I think, that obviously the push on the hydrocarbon sector is very low if they've just stayed at 80% all the time. But I think also we should be drawing and pulling people into those new technologies. And it's not so easy because it's much more distributed, as you're saying, but you can make savings in little places as well that go with it, and that's all part of the answer, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like I'm just still curious as to whether we are seeing the beginnings of a kind of new world order of energy taking shape, or is it still in the mess?
We're living the tipping point right now, for sure. I mean, I'm
at a turning point
of re-envisioning industrial society. I mean, it's nothing less. And I think, while I'm still dismayed at the amount of fossil fuel production we're seeing, new projects. I mean, we're in the UK. The UK is still considering the Cambo oil field. It's completely inconsistent with our goals of trying to ensure a safe climate here at COP26. But at the same time, what we know is that social change isn't linear. It happens at tipping point moments, and I think we're seeing that. We've had more technological breakthroughs and in fact more climate policy introduced in the last 2 years than in the last 20 years. We are here at COP finally starting to have a conversation about fossil fuels, which seems ironic, but it's true. And that, I don't know, something like 10 COPs in, and it's been an uphill climb just to even talk about how we need to constrain production. And I think that's starting to happen. We're seeing trillions of dollars in divestment. The divestment movement over the last 10 years has been astounding to watch. And now when you talk to many universities, when you talk to pensions funds, I spoke to a big pension fund the other day, they're now assessing their fiduciary responsibility to move, because you can actually make more money if you get out of fossil fuels, because despite the wealth, despite the push, oil and gas companies are operating now at the bottom of the S&P. No, there have been more bankruptcies in oil and gas companies than any other sector in the last year.
Well, over the last few years, they've been a very poor investment. Yeah. They have done well, the last few months. Bertrand. Yeah.
I think there is another reason why it goes so slowly. It's the fact that we always try to see the problem outside of ourselves. It's always the other one who is guilty. Yeah. So in terms of oil and gas, let's be a bit provocative, if you allow me. 5 to 10% of the problem comes from the oil companies, from their scope, producing, refining, and distributing. 90% of the problem is us. As consumers, we consume this oil. So as long as we say the problem is the oil companies, we feel very, very well and we continue business as usual. It's ridiculous. We have to see where we can reduce our consumption of oil. I put a heat pump in my house instead of an oil heating system, insulated the house, solar panels in the garden, an electric car. I tell you, I don't use a lot of oil outside of the products that I'm buying, because of course the clothing are transported with oil, the phones are transported with oil, all the international trade is like this. When we travel by airplane, we do. But in this case, I think we also have to see where we can consume more local, better quality. If you consume better quality, you don't need to buy as much and to waste as much. So I think we should put much more the responsibility on the population in general and say, you can be part of the solution instead of always saying the other one's the problem.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I have to weigh in here, Bertrand, because I think that's exactly what the oil companies have wanted for the past 30 years. They want to put the onus on our lifestyle. They want people to feel guilty. And what happens if you look at the research in climate communications and climate psychology is when people feel guilty about their lifestyle, they turn away from engaging in the climate crisis, in the climate emergency. We need everyone to engage right now. And it's not about whether you have the money to buy an electric car, I don't think, or better light bulbs, as Al Gore would say. It's about better laws. And if politicians don't feel like they have the support from civil society to make those difficult laws and changes, they won't. And the industry has spent 30 years funding climate denial and climate science, and that's now proven in lawsuits around the world. And so now they're not denying it anymore, but it's like they've gone from a denial to a delusion with their net zero modeling and claims that they can store enough carbon, sequester enough carbon through technologies that are not cost competitive at scale, that are not proving themselves, and haven't been for years.
I agree with that.
And over projections of nature sequestration so that they can justify continuing to expand. And so I think they want people to feel guilty. And they should be responsible for the fact that they knew, they funded denial, and now they're funding lobbyists to weaken climate laws at this important moment in history. So I don't think it's about what the people watching are buying. I think it's about whether you're calling your members of parliament and telling them you support them for doing the right thing.
Yes, but for this, you need the support of the population. If the governments are taking national regulations, making new laws, and the people are not supporting it, it will not happen. In France, for 8 cents in the oil price for cars, you had millions of gilets jaunes in the streets for months. In Switzerland, there was a project of a CO2 law that was rejected by the population in public vote because people think we are not the problem, the others are the problem, we don't want to change anything. And this is why I believe that you need the regulations, you need the funding, but you also need to show where you have to act at your level instead of always saying the other one has to act. And if you tell to the population, reducing your oil consumption is profitable because renewables are cheaper, renovating your house makes you save money on the energy bill, having a heat pump is much better in terms of funding. It's divided by 3 in terms of energy bill. If you do all that, you will have all the population understand one thing. CO2 is not only a factor of climate change, CO2 is an indicator of energy waste. You produce more CO2 if you use more energy. So if you reduce your energy consumption by being efficient, you are clean, but you are more profitable. And this is something that is usually forgotten in most of the debate.
Okay. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. How do we do that?
Looks like there's one right there.
There's one there.
I can't see very well.
Can you put more light in the room, please, so we can see who is speaking?
Light, if that makes it
Yes.
easier for you. Hi, my name is Sala. I represent Eclipse Venture Capital. It's a $3 billion industrial fund. And I'm going to attempt to be the pacifist between the two of you, mostly because I agree with both of you in that 5 to 10% is coming directly from the oil industry, and 90% is distributed across the value chain. But I don't know if I want to push it all the way down to the consumer, although some very engaged consumers should be there. But people, organizations rather, buy that oil and then sell it to the consumer. And often those organizations that are buying that oil and burning it to produce the clothes we wear and everything else kind of point to the oil company as well. Do you think there's a middle ground where redistributing the cost of transitioning to a carbon efficient or decarbonized economy should be not only fronted by the demons of today, but rather the people through the value chain that benefit from the oil that they're actually extracting?
Well, I believe that there should be a price on carbon on everything we buy and sell, just because it's an externality that should be internalized. When you buy a fridge, at the end of the life of the fridge, you're not throwing it in nature. You have bought a sticker that guarantees that it is recycled. And I think it should be the same for CO2. And if you put a fair price on CO2, which is actually the price to reabsorb it, and not just money that goes into the national budget of a country, then it makes people much more aware of the economy of energy. And by the way, can you imagine that oil companies are supporting actively the principle of a CO2 tax, not just for the environment, but because it will kill the coal business, which is a competitor to oil, and coal is worse than oil, so we're doing a little bit of good like this, but also because the oil companies want predictability. What is terrible for the industry is not knowing what will happen. But if they know that there is a price of $100 per ton of CO2, they will just integrate it inside their business. So the consumer at this moment will pay the real price of what he's buying. And this will be on the clothing, it will be on the computers, it will be on everything. And then you will find people who will say, I will keep my computer a bit longer. I will keep my phone a little bit longer. I will not buy 3 T-shirts and wear them once. I will buy a good T-shirt and wear it 3 times. And this is the way for me to reach what I call the qualitative growth. Qualitative growth is when you create jobs and make money by replacing what is polluting by what is protecting the environment.
Can I weigh in on that as well? I mean, besides my hat of chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, I also helped run an organization called Stand.earth. And for the last decade, we've been doing supply chain analysis to try and understand the climate impacts from the ground all the way to the consumer. And one of the things that, I agree with you, we need responsibility throughout the value chain, especially in industries like the fashion industry. We're talking about 4 to 6% of global emissions. And up until a couple of years ago, the fashion industry, while they said they were climate leaders, they only had Scope 1 and Scope 2 climate commitments, so where their stores are and the transportation of their goods. 80% of the emissions in the fashion industry comes from Scope 3, where they plug in and produce their clothes. And so it's only in the last couple of years, in part because of the report cards that we've produced showing all the major brands and what their full climate impacts are, that we're now starting to see some of the major brands put in place Scope 3 emissions reduction plans and even build renewable energy for their factories and encourage the governments where they're operating in to have renewable energy, to say, look, we don't want to make our clothes from coal. And our research is showing that there is new fracking, new coal plants just being built for those big brands to make their clothes. And then there's the shipping industry, which is about 2% now of global emissions and not captured under the Paris Agreement, not captured in most nation states' climate policies. And I think, again, we're starting to see some really interesting leadership there from Maersk, a cargo company who is committing now to decarbonize shipping. But most of the shipping companies, even though they know they could switch from heavy fuel oil, which is essentially a toxic waste when on land, and causes a massive double climate impact of black carbon, instead of shifting from heavy fuel oil to even a lower distillate fuel, they're still using heavy fuel oil because it's cheaper. They're not using slow shipping policies or routes, even though they know that that alone can be a 30% reduction in emissions from the shipping industries. So we need to hold the big brands who transport their goods accountable to pushing the shipping industry, and we need the shipping industry to step up to the plate, because right now the commitments that are being put forward by most of the companies, as well as the IMO shipping climate plan, is just too weak to meet the Paris Agreement. So I agree, there's work to be done throughout the supply chain.
I just really wanted to add a comment also on, the pull towards renewables. I mean, people talk about the fact that, to produce the metals that are going to make the renewables, there's an energy cost to those. But you've got the added benefit that there's opportunities to cut energy costs in that metal supply chain, and so the drivers on those industries is going to bring that down. And unlike hydrocarbons, of course, the product itself is inherently carbon rich, whereas, if in the renewable sector, you can't argue that we are going to move towards things that might cost in carbon to get out of the ground, but those are industries where inherently we can push that carbon emission down. So 10 years' time, the renewable sector will be fueled by a mining industry that is hopefully very, very near to carbon neutral.
Is there another question?
Thank you. Thanks for this talk. You mentioned that there's been trillions divested from fossil fuel companies. Do you think divestment or activist investment is a more successful strategy to accelerate a transition? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think it is not only more successful, but I think it is absolutely critical. Because we are living the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. And these companies, while they recognize now the challenge that we have, they all want to be the last barrel sold. And so they're all hoping that they can continue to produce and justify production. And in fact, the structures of most of the companies mean that expansion is essential. It's essential for CEOs' salaries. And so there's some major barriers to the companies actually moving towards what's being called net zero. And we don't have a single oil company yet who has committed to absolute emission and production decline. And that's, I don't think, going to happen through engagement. I think it's really naive to think that we are going to engage these companies in designing their own demise, because they're not all going to survive. That doesn't mean, though, the countries where the companies are currently extracting can't survive. Because we can diversify economies, we can move and create new economies and even more job opportunities in clean energy. It's not going to be some of these same companies.
Bertrand, did you want to?
Yes, there are some oil companies who have clearly committed to reduce the absolute quantity of oil they're extracting and selling. And of course, they have to compensate with other sources of income, which is hydrogen, which is natural gas, which is renewable electricity. And maybe not as much in the US, but in Europe, very, very clearly. And they need money for that. And this is a good way to reinvest money that is divested out of the coal industry. BNP Paribas has clearly taken the commitment, and they are doing it now, to have no more coal investment, no more unconventional oil extraction. So it's a clear commitment. They do it. Now, of course, oil is something we still need today. If you cut all the oil business today, you destroy all the economical system and all the life of the people. So you need to do it in the right way. And finance is a way to redirect these investments into the new business opportunities of the oil and gas companies.
Okay.
So I would agree with Bertrand on the question of if there is an oil company that has said, fine, we'll stop expansion, then I think that's right. And that's why there's a new initiative that was launched here at COP called the Oil and Gas Exit List by an organization called Urgewald. They made the coal exit list a decade ago. And they're trying to help investors differentiate between the different oil companies. No one is saying we have to turn off the taps overnight. Yes, we still use oil and gas. It's impossible to turn off the taps overnight. But we can stop expansion today, which is what the science requires, no new projects, and we have enough already in the system and under construction to use while we wind down. And in fact, if we used everything that was already under construction or being produced today, and we burned that oil, that would take us to 2 degrees. So any new projects is oil that takes us past 2 degrees right now. So what we're saying in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is that we need to stop expansion and wind it down. And we've been working with universities around the world. We actually have a report called the Fossil Fuel Exit Strategy, which crunches all of those numbers, if anyone's interested.
Are there any more?
Still in there.
Is there?
Behind the pillar there.
Sorry, I can't see very.
Yeah.
Hi, Melissa Davis. I wonder what you thought about as the big majors do sell off their assets. There seems to be a bit of a trend about private equity buying up some of these assets. And I say this, you mentioned the Amazon I was there, I had the misfortune of meeting someone who owned one of those, who had just set up a private equity company a year before and was just buying up all these assets that nobody wanted. Lack of accountability, nobody knows the name of these companies unless you're in that area, and I just wondered about your thoughts on this to the panel.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. And I think we need international cooperation to figure out what happens with these so-called assets. 10 years ago, there was the Yasuni ITT proposal to keep it in the ground, to support actually buying out the assets. Today we have the ESCOM proposal. So will public money go to actually trying to keep it in the ground? How much will governments be liable for if they stop permitting? Will there be lawsuits? These trade and liability issues, these questions of actually how we retire fossil fuel assets are absolutely critical and can't just be left up to the marketplace. That's why we need international cooperation. It's why we need countries talking about what is the plan to wind down production. And I think the emergence of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance here at COP with the leadership of Denmark and Costa Rica, and we hear soon to be announced many other countries, is a real sign of hope that countries are actually going to start collaborating to talk about how we wind down production. The other piece that's critical is knowing who's producing and how much. Today, there is no way to know that. There is no registry, there is no global accounting, unless you buy the data from Rystad or Wood Mackenzie. And that's why Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor this week are announcing a new global registry of fossil fuel production and reserves. It'll be released here at COP, the prototype for that. And that's going to be essential for actually looking at who's producing what, how much, and making a plan and ensuring accountability and transparency on the production side of the ledger.
If you look at another angle, it's quite interesting to see that in a company for oil and gas, the specialists cannot do something else than oil and gas. But the finance people of the company can buy other companies who do something else. And it's the acquisitions, external acquisitions, who are going to help the oil companies to produce less oil and to have more of renewables and more of other things. So they expand in other ways. And this is where they need to be supported, because all these acquisitions are expensive. So I think the investment and the pensions funds and all this should go for this type of investments.
Is there another question?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Australia. And Australia is currently subsidizing oil and gas companies. And so I was going to ask, what are the pressure mechanisms that you can do for nations to sign such treaties like you mentioned, to plan for a green transition?
Well, on the advocacy front, I think the most exciting initiative we're seeing is parliamentarians from around the world who are calling for a wind down of fossil fuel production and an end to subsidies, a managed decline instead of an unmanaged decline. It's an initiative that emerged out of the Global South, a number of parliamentarians from around the world who put together a declaration and a letter. Again, that will be released here at COP26. Fossil-free future, I think, is the website for that, but we'll post it also on fossilfueltreaty.org. I understand they now have 150 parliamentarians from 31 countries. Growing that list, encouraging individual leadership is going to be essential to pushing nation states to commit to actually reducing those fossil fuel subsidies.
Bertrand.
And you know, there is one number I'd like to give you now and leave you with. Out of the production of energy in this world, three quarters, 75% at least, is lost because of wrong behaviors or old and outdated systems that are inefficient. So we are in the world like a stupid guy in a bathtub with a leak. And instead of solving the leak, the guy is opening the tap wide open to compensate the loss of water. We do this with energy. So first we have to stop the leak. We have to use energy efficiently. And then you will see that there will be much less production just because we will not need as much. And this we have to remember.
we do have to bear in mind, though, with the move to renewables and electric vehicles, that our energy needs are going to increase. You know, we've calculated that just for the UK to completely move to electric vehicles, we need a 20% increase in the... Unless there is a change in people's habits of having to have a car. So that's another story. But if you just do the straight sums, you'll need more electricity.
I don't agree. It's an increase in electricity use. It is not an increase in energy use. And electricity in a European country is about 20% of the need of energy. This is electricity. So if you see it on a global scale, a thermal engine has an efficiency of 27% at the most. It means that 3/4 of the energy is lost in your fuel tank. You fill the tank, 3/4 is lost because of the bad efficiency of the engine. If you have an electric engine, you have 97% of efficiency. You lose 3%. So in terms of energy, if you go into electric mobility, into heat pumps, and all these type of things using electricity...
Therefore, I'm going to have to ask you to close your points.
Okay, yes. So you will increase electricity use, but you will decrease much massively the energy use in general, including, of course, oil and gas.
Well, I think we agree with that, yeah.
I want to thank our panel very much for an interesting discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.